Alright, let's start the video. I do apologize for not making a video yesterday, but these two should hopefully cover it. Now, this was actually the one I wanted to make a video on yesterday, but I just forgot to type it out. Plus, I need to do some more research to make sure I got things prepared so I could explain this. Now, if you know my channel, you likely have heard of my idea to have a permanent fund to fund the federal government. Now, of course, the extreme austerity measures I proposed naturally would not lend them to the US states for a number of reasons, but it is something I would like to propose similar, just without the same methods. See, all US states, to one extent or another, rely on taxation as their primary source of income. It could be property taxes, maybe sales taxes, a few have income taxes. Regardless, a lot of it relies on taxation of individuals. Now, what I'm proposing here is the idea of raising the finances to let me rephrase. It's to raise the finances of the states to establish a state permanent fund for their own states, and to establish these funds throughout the US, which will then invest in local businesses, similar to the Alaska Permanent Fund, and use the wealth to fund said states. So, for example, let's take Texas as just one, since it's also an oil state like Alaska. They raise some money, put it in a permanent fund as the principal, and then that permanent fund will invest in local Alaska businesses, be it oil, gas, or maybe something else. It all depends on what the state decides is most profitable to invest in, and then it'll take the dividends, and instead of using taxation, will use the dividends to pay for state services. And the idea is that eventually, with the states being funded by dividends instead of taxes, the tax rate can go down, going lower and lower, until eventually all taxes at the state level can be abolished, which should make things easier on the people and also on the federal government, since it gives them a lot more leeway when it comes to taxation without necessarily worrying about their people being out of money. Naturally, some inflation proofing will need to be done. Let's face it, so long as inflation is a thing that the government has, you're going to have to factor it in for any plan, be it taxation or a permanent fund. Because, for those who don't know, tax brackets have to constantly be adjusted because of inflation, because, well, $100,000, yeah, that's a lot of money, but if the inflation rate is, say, 2%, just as a baseline, then you're looking at $102,000 being equivalent to $100,000 last year. And naturally, with inflation comes an increase in expenditure for the states because they have to pay for more things. And so, with the permanent funds, part of the earnings of the permanent funds will have to be reinvested into the principal every year as a inflation proofing measure. So, basically, they have to constantly pay back the principal to ensure that it can hold and make roughly enough that the government can still be funded. And despite the challenges that come with such a plan, naturally, as stated, not only do you have the inflation proofing, you also have to raise the money in the first place, and it also includes market volatility, runaway inflation, etc. Despite all these challenges, a permanent fund should still be a reliable way to fund the state governments compared to taxation, which is also impacted by market shocks indirectly, because, well, if people don't have their jobs, they ain't paying income taxes. If they lose money, they ain't paying sales taxes because they're not buying as much. And if they lose a house, they ain't paying property taxes. So, with market volatility, if things go south, your tax revenue is going to go down too, so it doesn't really change the fact that the permanent fund is a, I'll say bluntly, more moral way to raise funds than taxation. And also a more efficient way, because it's a self-increasing cycle. More money to the people means more spending means more businesses growing means more dividends, and so it'll compound, continually growing itself naturally. Now, using Alaska's permanent fund as a baseline would be a good one just so we have perspective. See, these changes will take some time and require investment into the permanent funds, but will pay off in the long run, with a lot of states likely copying Alaska's basics just with tweaks based on the fact that, one, Alaska's is a constitutional amendment, so they'd either have to copy making it an amendment or make it a law through some other method. Two, Alaska has a heavy tax on resource wealth, which a lot of states probably won't support, so that as well. And three, importantly, Alaska's can also be used with permanent fund dividends, which, while they would likely not be banned by these states for the purposes of the permanent fund, it's not the main purpose. The permanent fund exists to pay the government so that it doesn't need taxation. The idea of dividends wouldn't be for the people, but for the states, so that they don't need to take as much money from the people. So those are a few caveats. Now, taxes may need to be raised at first or cuts done to ensure the surplus for the permanent fund, even if only for a short time, because if the permanent fund begins paying dividends, they'll be able to lower them back to pre-permanent fund levels. But for the first bit, you do need that injection of capital to establish the principle. If you have a roughly balanced budget, then you don't have the room to invest in a permanent fund. You'd need a surplus, and a significant enough one that it actually starts bringing in money from the dividends, enough to actually pay for the states. Keep in mind, the states generally operate in the realm of billions of dollars in terms of government funding. Their budgets are in the billions, so naturally, it's going to take a lot of money to start having a fund that can pay for all that. And short of extreme austerity, most states aren't going to be able to go tax-free in the next decade. However, any reduction of the financial burdens of Americans is more than welcome. I'm sure several people would take the trade of 2% taxation for 1 or 2 years if it means that in the long term they pay 5% less in taxes, and with the potential of going completely tax-free within their lifetime. I mean, freak, that would be lovely for a lot of people. Now, of course, this is only state level. You're likely not going to be able to see the same for the federal government, because it's going to need to make a lot bigger moves given its debts. Given its debts, and also the fact that, well, the longer it lasts, the worse it gets. But with the federal government, you would have to handle it separately from the states. So, just as a general rule, treat the federal government as a separate thing. Currently, we are just looking at the state tax levels. But even just reducing the state tax burden would still be welcome for both ends. Because for the individual living in the state in question, well, less money that is being taken from them, that's very welcome. And for the federal government, that is almost certainly going to boost GDP, which means more tax revenue from the people living in the state, which means, oh boy, more income for the state. Everyone wins. But just to give an example of what I mean, using Alaska as a baseline, I looked up some information on Alaska to do the math for its permanent fund, assuming it is to subsume all the roles of paying for the government. So, I looked up the principal. The Alaska Permanent Fund Company provided that. They have about $89.3 billion of principal, which is the investments that can't be touched, which make earnings. Now, they had the average earnings over 5 years, and what they showed was that in 5 years they made $25 billion, divide by 5, $5 billion. So, with the current budget, what I could find being $13.1 billion, we have to first figure out the principal and how much is being earned off it. The division was done here, and that's 5 billion divided by 89.3, and so it's roughly in the middle, but it's about roughly 5 to 6% of the principal is being made into earnings, which means the large permanent fund, if it is going to pay for the entire budget, needs to be roughly 5% of the principal. Now, in order to figure out what that is, you take 13.1, make it equal 5%. which is 13.1 divided by 0.05, and you get $262 billion. That is the needed principal to pay for the Alaska budget. Subtract what principal is already there, and you have $172.7 billion, which, assuming a 10-year plan, would be an extra $17.27 billion every year added to the permanent fund, assuming things stay the same. Now, with compound interest, this could probably be sped up, and assuming the average earnings stay the same or rise, it could probably be done quicker, but for a good low-ball worst-case scenario, that is what is needed. Which, if I remember correctly from my research, Alaska's GDP is like $47 billion, so close to $50 billion GDP. Yeah, no. That is well over 20% of the GDP every year. That is not happening. Especially because the state government is also getting potential tax revenue taken by the federal government, paying for its own things. So a 10-year plan is unlikely given this worst-case scenario. Could it theoretically be done? I mean, yeah, but good luck getting the people to agree to that. And, of course, Alaska is rather exceptional when it comes to this because, well, despite being a relatively small state in population, second smallest in population, by the way, and with the smallest population density, it has a budget only $2 billion lower than South Carolina. Yes, South Carolina, not a frontier state like Wyoming, which has a low population. No, South Carolina, one of the more popular states on the East Coast, or Southeast, rather. I mean, it's still not nothing, but it's rather expensive given how much GDP Alaska has. So, this is basically a low ball of low balls, taking a state which, if you look into its GDP growth, is rather low, and also factoring in that it has a far larger budget than population. Factoring all that in, you'd need about $17 billion annually, which isn't very achievable for Alaska. But for other U.S. states, there are far more reliable ways to achieve similar results. Of course, they don't have the head start of an already established principle, so they're going to be basically working from scratch. So it's still unlikely that they can go completely tax-free within a decade. But they can still do a lot. And if they do, like for example, especially the South, as a lot of people are moving to them, if they do start establishing these permanent funds to pay for their taxes, and thus lowering the tax rates overall, not only are there people going to have more money, which is great for the people, obviously, but also it'll incentivize more people to move there and more businesses to go there, meaning it's even more the case that people will try to flood into those states. And so you have a situation where every other state is pressured to either adopt a permanent fund to keep up or be left behind. And I think we can safely say being left behind is not a thing many states are interested in. And so, the permanent funds could be used as pressure to encourage everyone else to adopt them as well, which could result in a net lowering of taxation for every American. Something very, very useful. There's also just an economic benefit to this as well. Even ignoring just the fact that more people have more money, with the permanent funds as they are, you're going to find increased investment to local businesses. More investment means more jobs being produced because the businesses have more wealth and are almost certainly going to want to exploit that to make more money, which means more businesses, more jobs, and more profits. And so, more jobs means more people employed. More people employed means higher competition. Higher competition means wages can go up, or at the very minimum stay the same without getting faced with cuts. And thus, the economy will grow. The economy grows, tax revenues increase, the permanent funds grow faster, and it helps the federal government because they're bringing in more receipts to pay off their expenditures. and thus this helps everyone. And so I would firmly support these positions and argue for each state to establish their own permanent funds. Now with Alaska, it's a bit unique, purely because what I'm essentially advocating for is sort of separating the permanent fund down the middle, establishing a firmly state-based permanent fund whose existence is to pay for the state, and one that generates for the dividends, or at the very least, separating the two, because there is no way that Alaskans are going to say, oh yes, let's just forfeit our PFDs, basically our universal basic income, because the state wants to keep more money. No. I do not see Alaskans agreeing to that voluntarily. In fact, they'd likely vote out whoever tried to put that into place. But with the other states, they don't got that. There is no PFD sales that businesses put up. There is no constant established tradition of every year we get a PFD. No. So with Alaska, they're going to have to handle it differently purely because, well, they're used to getting the dividends. But the other states can focus purely on paying for the state and lowering their taxes in proportion to the state income from the permanent funds and its dividends. And so that is what should be done. As always, there will be differences state by state. Our governments are not made to be the same. They're made to be based in their local peoples so they can experiment and try things that they believe will help them specifically rather than the whole country. The federal government's job is to handle things that the whole country handles. Everyone in the country handles the potential risk of war. So the military falls to them. Diplomacy falls to them since everyone's impacted on how that goes. But the matter of roads, that's generally left to the states unless the federal government wants to work with the states, and even then it's working with them, not for them, to build them. With the exception of the interstates, pretty much every road in the country is handled privately or by the states, mainly the states and local governments. That is the point of federalism. And so, naturally, these state permanent funds will have to be taken up differently, state by state. But even still, I do believe it would further our interest to establish them. And I do hope that people try it, or at the very least, look into it further, because I don't have as much information as other people. I'm sure an economist or an accountant could probably do far better on actually drawing up the estimated time here. In terms of just numbers, they'd probably be better able to handle that. I don't have as much information because I'm largely relying on Google, because, well, that's where I can find the information, and what I do know from basic arithmetic. So yeah, that's my proposal for the state permanent funds. I do hope you like the idea, and can rip it to shreds or find ways to explain why you believe it should be adopted. Frankly, if you can do both, that'd be lovely. It's always fun to argue. But I hope you have a good day. Thank you for watching.